I just want to present some elementary economic considerations and use them in order to shed some light on historical developments. So this is a little bit an exercise in theory and history, how theory can illustrate historical developments, how theory can be used in order to get some correct interpretation of historical processes. So let me start by again repeating the definition of a state, because I want to take that as a starting point in order to explain certain things. So the state is defined as the territorial monopolist of ultimate decision making. In a given territory, any type of conflict, the state is the ultimate decider, as Bush used to say. It is also an institution that can impose taxes on its citizens unilaterally, that is without the consent of people. We know what this implies internally, so to speak, for the citizens living in a state. On the one hand, as I explained in previous lectures, there is a tendency for the quality of justice to continuously decline and for the price of justice to continuously go up. What I want to concentrate on, however, is not so much the internal policies of states, but foreign relations. What you realize immediately is if you would have a state, and all states begin, so to speak, as small states, ruling over very small territories, what states would be immediately confronted with if they claim to be able to tax people, and if they claim to be the ultimate decision maker in any case of conflict, including conflicts involving the state itself, is the problem of exit. People will simply move away from people who rip them off. This is obviously a challenge to states. After all, they are in the business of milking the cows, and if the cows then stray and try to find greener pastures someplace else, you have to make an effort, so to speak, to recapture them. And in recapturing them, you might well encounter other states. That is, the people might not have just moved to a territory where there exists no state at all. They might have just moved from a state that was more exploitative, so to speak, to a state that was less exploitative. And in this way, states either to capture people again or to capture them from living in other state areas, states almost necessarily get into conflicts with each other. And from the outset, it should be pointed out that states tend to be more aggressive agencies than normal business companies or normal private citizens for a very straightforward reason. If I, as a private person, want to beat you up, then I have to fund my own bodyguards, pay for my own weapons and sticks and so forth in order to beat up on you. And that might be an expensive venture. For states, the situation is slightly different when it comes to deciding, should I engage in aggressive activities or should I refrain from aggressive activities? Because states, insofar as they can tax people, and insofar as they are the ultimate judge in every type of internal conflicts, can externalize the cost of aggression. That is, that they can make other people pay for the cost involved in engaging in aggressive activities. Would I, given, so to speak, my natural inclination to be aggressive or to be not aggressive, would I tend to be more aggressive if I knew that I could always make you pay for all the resources necessary for me to engage in aggressive activity? Or would I be less inclined to give into my aggressive impulses if I would have to bear all the cost myself? The answer is, of course, yes. If I can externalize the cost of aggression onto other people, whatever my initial natural inclination is, I will tend to be more aggressive than I otherwise would be if other people can be made to pay for me being an aggressor. And give you an example. Would Bush have invaded Iraq if he himself and his buddies would have to finance the whole thing themselves? And the answer is, that is difficult to imagine. If Cheney and his buddies and Bush and his buddies and whatever some companies that gain from this would have to come up with the entire finances themselves, and if they would not have plenty of suckers who would have to pay for all of this. Okay? So by nature, states are aggressive institutions. So what they will do is, of course, by solving this problem of exit, people running away from them, they will naturally come into conflict with other states. And since on every territory there can only be one ultimate decision maker and one institution that has the right to tax, it should be perfectly clear. Imagine that everyone has the right to tax everyone. Then, of course, we would have immediately chaos breaking out. There would be no accumulation of wealth taking place anymore whatsoever, and so forth. So only one institution such as this can exist on any given territory. The competition between states that is frequently conducted in the form of wars is an eliminative competition. That is to say, if they get into conflict, the normal solution of the conflict is one state must be eliminated and another one simply expands its territory. So what we can explain is why there is in history a tendency towards concentration of governments, why there is a tendency for the number of independent states to decline in the course of time, until we would ultimately reach, so to speak, the point of a world state. And you realize that if you would have a one world state, then the problem of exit would of course have disappeared completely. Because then the tax and regulation structure is exactly the same on the entire globe. There is no reason for people, no economic reason at least anymore, for people to move from one place to the other. So what I want you to realize is that this tendency towards a one world state is, so to speak, inherent in the nature of states. This does not have to come about as an ultimate result of historical developments, because they are, of course, also opposing forces. And I will talk about those a little bit later on. People can realize what is going on, oppose this tendency, but if we would leave them alone, so to speak, this development take its course, then we can see that the ultimate solution to government power is to establish a one world state. By the way, a very different way of coming up with this result than the reason given by classical liberals, who also sometimes dream of the one world state. Their idea is, however, we need this because only if we have a monopolist of law and order will there be peace existing among mankind. And as long as there are different states, people still people living in different countries still live in a state of anarchy vis-à-vis each other, and they also then construct this type of tendency towards a one world state, but with very different and completely false type of reasons. Now, when it comes to the question who will win and who will lose in this type of process of eliminative competition, you realize in the, can you just, I'm sorry. Who will win and who will lose in this eliminative competition? Business competition is, of course, not eliminative. It's like Ford and GM could conceivably compete until the end of the days against each other, and both remain in existence. But with states, of course, it is a different type of competition. So who will win and who will lose? And there we reach an interesting conclusion. Obviously, in order to conduct a war, or even if it is not an outright war, at least a policy of threatening your neighbors to adhere to your commands, to establish some sort of hegemony. You need resources to engage in a policy such as this. That should be, in particular, especially clear in the case of engaging in a war where you need weapons, ammunition, supply lines, and especially if the war drags on, what becomes very important is that you need a productive population that continues to feed the war machine. So what is necessary in order to win a war is that you have to have a comparatively productive economy. So we reach, so to speak, a paradoxical result. That is, that those states, if we assume the outset they have roughly the same territorial size and roughly the same number of people available to them, that those states who conduct an internally more liberal policy in the classical European sense, that is being not too exploitative, showing a certain respect for private property rights, not punishing productive individuals and so forth, that internally liberal states, because they create a more prosperous domestic economy, tend to be more aggressive in their foreign policy, because they know that they will likely win in such adventures due to their better functioning domestic economy as compared with countries that are internally more oppressive. I know that some Americans were always surprised when years ago I started just presenting these types of arguments. Compare, for instance, the foreign policy of the United States with the foreign policy of the former Soviet Union. There can be absolutely no doubt that the former Soviet Union was, of course, an extremely oppressive state internally. It was terrible. My family, refugees coming from East Germany, so I'm very much familiar with the awful conditions that existed in these places. And of course, America was the land of the free, or at least from the point of view of the Americans, I was thinking that the land of the free. But when we look at now the foreign policy, how many countries did they attack? How many wars did they start? And so forth. We find surprisingly that the foreign policy of the United States was far more aggressive than the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. And why was it? Because the rulers in the Soviet Union full well knew that they had a basket case economy at their own hands. And unless the countries would be very small and in their immediate vicinity, they would likely not be successful in conducting warlike activities. They were not even successful in attacking small neighbors in Afghanistan, for instance. On the other hand, the United States, of course, full well knew that they would come out successful, most likely successful in any type of war adventure that they engaged in. And of course they did. They did precisely because all states tend to be aggressive. But what they do is, of course, they look at what are my chances at winning in a situation where I go to war. And the Americans knew they would most likely win because they had a domestic economy that was more productive than any other comparably sized country in the world. There are historical examples that go further back than this. If we look, so to speak, at imperialist ventures, we always find that the imperialist ventures were started by the most liberal type countries. The Netherlands, one of the very first countries where capitalism flourished, a very teeny country. Nonetheless, the Netherlands was for a while an extremely imperialist place, just having colonies all the way to Indonesia. Then I'll come to an explanation why one country was replaced by another one in this imperialism. Then we have Great Britain doing the same thing. So Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain. Capitalism is flourishing and so forth. And Great Britain becomes the foremost imperial power. And then after with World War I, this role of Great Britain is taken over by the United States. So since World War I, the United States becomes the foremost imperial nation. To illustrate this again, you have to see best indicator for this is where do Americans have troops stationed? And there are very few countries in the world where Americans do not have troops stationed. Practically every European country has American troops. What would America think, for instance, if there would be Chinese troops stationed here holding maneuvers on American soil, German troops stationed here holding maneuvers on American soil? Would they think that their own sovereignty is somehow impaired? I think they definitely would. So European states are not as sovereign as they present themselves to be. It is a sign of not being really a sovereign country that you do have troops, rockets, weapon depots of a foreign country stationed in your own country. What was the reason why we have this change, so to speak, from Netherlands to England to the United States and so forth? Now again, if you look, the closer you come, so to speak, to the ultimate goal of reaching world hegemony, the less reasons do you have to remain internally liberal and introduce more and more regulations, increase more and more the taxes that you impose domestically. And this explains, so to speak, the slow decline of the Netherlands and the slow decline of Britain. And it will ultimately, I think, also explain the decline of the American empire. Again, recall, all states like to crack down on their own population. They are liberal because they realize, hey, when I'm liberal, I can be more aggressive. The more successful you are as an aggressor, the larger the territories are that you somehow directly or indirectly control, the less reason do you have then to retain, to keep up this domestic liberalism that enabled you in the first place to become this dominant power. And again, you can see this if we look at the current world. with America being the dominant country on the globe, you can see there is a systematic attempt made now, for instance, to harmonize taxation on a worldwide scale. Just in recent years, we had tremendous attempts made by the United States, for instance, to attack countries like Switzerland. Tell Switzerland, look, your taxation is just too low. You have bank secrecy laws that make it possible that Americans do not pay their fair share in taxes and evade paying taxes and go to other places. And what do we do to you if you don't behave is we simply expropriate the branches of the major banks, Swiss banks in the United States. The European countries, again, countries that are all dominated by the United States, they are to a large extent nothing but puppets of United States government, again, as indicated by the troops all over the place. The European governments do exactly the same, just attacking Liechtenstein, small places that have extremely low rates of taxation and very good bank secrecy laws, that this cannot be tolerated. It is just unfair competition that some countries have only whatever income taxes of 5% and other countries have income taxes of 40 or 50%. How unfair it is of these countries to compete with countries that have 50% income taxes. That must be stopped. And we are far on the way of stopping these types of ridiculous policies, protecting their own citizens from exploitation. Then we have free trade gradually being replaced by managed trade. Of course, managed trade in the sense that the dominant countries determine, so to speak, what the rules should be according to which various regions trade with each other. Consider something like the North American Free Trade Agreement, or consider the European Union. Of course, they sell these sorts of things as, we want to make sure that there is freedom of movement and freedom of trade among the North American countries, and we want to make sure that the same is also the case in Europe. But if you look at what the reality is, nothing could be further from the truth that these things have anything to do with free trade. If you want to have free trade, you need two sentences. That is, whoever wants to just send something abroad can do so. Whoever wants to buy something from abroad can also do so. That's all you need. In fact, however, the North American Trade Agreement is some paperwork of whatever 15, 16, 17,000 pages. Now, I'm asking you, how do you need a document of that size if all you want is free trade? These documents are documents that give special privileges to companies that have wonderful government connections and discriminate against other firms and companies that do not have these types of connections. The situation in Europe is even worse. In Europe, I think the documents are hundreds of thousands of pages that regulate what is allowed and is not allowed in the European Union. It is whenever new countries are admitted to the European Union is a major employment program because all these documents have to be translated into the other languages. So you imagine you have hundreds of thousands of pages now have to be transferred into Czech and then into Lithuanian and then to Polish. And then Croatian. Europe has many, many languages. For translators, this is a great thing that happens. I'm not so sure if it is really a great thing that happens for Europeans genuinely. By the way, you can still not in Europe, so to speak, just freely move goods from one place to the other. If you watch German TV, for instance, constantly they emphasize how successful the German customs officials were to prevent people coming over from Poland smuggling cigarettes over, because cigarettes are lower, the taxes on cigarettes are lower in Poland than they are in Germany. With great pride do they appear on TV and say, look, we caught this guy and we caught that guy. I thought free trade means you can just ship your stuff wherever you want. So we have managed trade, and we have managed migration movements also. And there is an interesting aspect to this. There is of course a resistance against large-scale immigration, and you break this by allowing it. You break down regional identities that exist. Regional identities are also something that stands in the way of expanding government power. And in order to enhance government power by allowing massive immigration of people from very different places, culturally very different places, you break down regional and national identities. This is one of the purpose, I think, behind policy of massive third world immigration permitted in Europe as well as in the United States. And at the same time, you have massive amounts of regional income redistribution, just as you have income redistribution within each country from one group to another. You have this now because of these institutions such as North American Free Trade Agreement and the EU, also massive international income redistributions with the same type of purpose to make entire regions dependent on the center of power. And the policy is always the same, so to speak. You support regions that engage in ridiculous policies and take the money from regions that conduct a somewhat more wise economic policy. Massive funds are poured into southern Italy, for instance, because that has been an economic basket case for many, many years. Now, once they admitted even other countries, former East Bloc countries, let's say, Bulgaria, Romania, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Lithuania, Estonia, and so forth, all of these countries are showered with huge numbers of donations, so-called donations from Germany, France, and the more successful countries in the European Union, in order to make these countries entirely dependent on the center from which all this money comes from. Okay. Now maybe I want to come to what is probably the most important indicator of hegemonic relationships that exist, and that is, these are monetary affairs. The status of the United States as the leading imperialist country can be recognized in the most pronounced way by the status that the US dollar has as the international reserve currency. Other countries use the US dollar as reserves and invest these reserves, so to speak, by buying American government bonds. So supporting, in a way, the American system, having themselves an interest that the American state continues going on, in order to be able to just pay the interest on these government bonds, which is then paid to whatever, China, India, Germany, whatever these countries are. But you can also see, of course, that the American empire is at least somewhat crumbling. That is, that they experience something similar to what Britain experienced before, what the Netherlands experienced before, because the willingness of other countries to use US dollars as their reserve currency is somewhat declining. It is still the dominant currency, no question about it, but the proportion of reserves that countries hold in terms of dollars is on the way down, and other currencies in the portfolio of central banks are on the increase. We say, again, just go a little bit astray for a moment. Let me also make a few remarks about the role of the democracy in all of this plays in particular. I talked about some of the aspects of democracy in yesterday's lecture. Let me add a little bit more to this in order to give you another reason to see how dangerous this currently spread ideology on the part of the United States is, that democracy has to be promoted in particular. Imagine that we would have a world democracy, one man, one vote on a worldwide scale. What would then most likely happen? In that case, we would get most likely an Indian-Chinese coalition government, by virtue of the numbers. And what would these Chinese-Indian coalition government most likely do in order to stay in power? Now they would do, of course, a massive redistribution of income. They would point out, look, Americans have plenty of cars, even their so-called clunkers are still luxury cars as compared to the cars that people have in most other countries. They can take vacation a lot, travel all over the place, have marvelous clothes and so forth. And how do we poor Indians and Chinese live? So a massive redistribution of income should take place. Precisely the same policy precisely the same thing happened internally in the United States, in Germany, in Italy, and so forth, in the course of the 19th century, when the right to vote was expanded to more and more people. Initially, the right to vote was restricted to property owners, actually major property owners, and the age restrictions were quite high. In many European countries, you had to be 30 before you acquired the right to vote, plus you had to be a property owner. Then there was all property requirements were then abolished, and the age limits were continuously decreased. Why were classical liberals frequently skeptical about expanding the right to vote? Because they knew what, of course, every person knows what will happen. That is, if it gives the right to vote also to those people who do not own anything, they will use the vote in order to vote themselves the property of people who have more than they themselves have. So as in the 19th century, the right to vote was expanded practically all over the world, especially in Europe, liberal parties, classical liberal parties, became increasingly less important, and socialistic parties became increasingly more important. And even the parties that were initially called liberal or conservative, their program became increasingly more socialistic, because they knew that the only way to just win the votes of the masses is to do what the masses want. The masses want redistribution of wealth and income. In Europe nowadays, even parties that call themselves liberal parties, parties that call themselves conservative parties, are parties that by and large adopt the program of the Communist Manifesto in the 19th century. Almost all the planks of the Communist Manifesto, except for the full-scale expropriation of factors of production, are in the meantime fulfilled and are endorsed by so-called liberal parties nowadays. So what you can see is that by expanding the right to vote, you necessarily create welfare state conditions, which ultimately, of course, cannot be financed and lead to the collapse of these systems. Let me just give you another example to illustrate this point, that the dramatic tendency towards an increase in the state, in welfare state policies through expansion of the franchise. Imagine for a second that we would give the right to vote to 12-year-olds. After all, we have no reason to stop at 18. It used to be 21, it used to be 25, it used to be 30 in some countries. In the meantime, we are at 18. Why not 12? Now, then I would not say that children will be elected to become the next president of the United States. But you can predict, of course, that every party will have a children platform. That is, we have to satisfy these people, just as every country now has a platform to cater to the elderly. The children, after all, are our future. We must see to it that nothing bad happens to them. And imagine what the consequence would be if every party has a platform for children. Then the policies will be even looking more childish than they currently already look. So there must be vouchers to go to McDonald's for each child. Toys R Us visits are free at least once a week. So it is clear that these sorts of expansions in the franchise will have disastrous effects. And one should not close the eyes before the fact that in every country that you look at, this same thing, for more and more childish policies to be introduced, has been the result of expanding the franchise to almost everyone. This, of course, will be ultimately one of the reasons why this whole system must collapse. That cannot be financed. So now, what can we do about all of this? All that sounds very pessimistic. I want to talk a little bit about alternatives, strategies. Not a strategy towards the ultimate goal that we might have, privatizing the provision of security completely and abolishing the state entirely, but so to speak, intermediate goals that we might have, that one might be able to realistically pursue. And I want to say first, these strategies that I will just outline must begin, of course, with a recognition of what I have just explained about this tendency toward centralization. And centralization then leading to ever more invasive states and ever less protection of life and private property. The second thing, what I want to promote, is the idea that we have to adopt as a program, as a conscious program, a program of systematic secession. That is, we have to deliberately try to aim at the exact opposite of what has actually been going on for years, many decades, for hundreds of years. That is, we must increase the number of independent political units. We must aim not for a European superstate or for a world state. What we must aim for is instead a system where we have thousands of Liechtensteins, thousands of little Swiss cantons. And why should we aim for this? First of all, the most elementary reason is we see that if we look at these small states, Liechtenstein, Singapore, formerly Hong Kong, Andorra, also Switzerland and so forth, that these places are actually wealthier than the surrounding big units. Switzerland is richer than any of the European countries that are members of the European Union. Liechtenstein is even wealthier than people in Switzerland are. Singapore is an enormously successful country, far more successful than any of the surrounding areas. Hong Kong was extremely successful, and so forth. And of course, there are reasons for this. First, small political units must engage in free trade policies. Imagine that you are just a village and you say, okay, I'm engaging in heavy protectionist measures. What would happen to you? That most of the people would be dead in a week, if you would try to do this. On the other hand, if you have a huge country like the United States, because you have still large enough internal markets, even if you cut yourself off completely from the rest of the world, the standard of living will go down. But nonetheless, people will not die in the streets. So small countries must engage in free trade. Small countries can maintain, so to speak, their regional identity. They can prevent forced integration. Current immigration policies are frequently of such a kind where people who are very different are forced upon the own domestic population. Small countries can have their own immigration policy and see to it that only people come in who want to assimilate to the place where they go and do not destroy the domestic culture. If you are a small, homogeneous country, you have more reason to learn from mistakes. In the former Soviet Union or in former Yugoslavia, where they had artificial states created with people who culturally did not really want to get along with each other. It was always the case that whenever something went wrong, you just blamed the leading, the majority of the people for being responsible for it. The Estonians, the Lithuanians could always say, it's the damn Russians that do this to us. In Yugoslavia could also say, it's the damn Serbs who do that to the Croats and the Slovenes and so forth. And they were to a certain extent right in saying this. Now breaking up, there's nobody to blame except yourself. And in this way, of course, you will learn more easily than if you can always blame it on somebody else. In addition, if you have very small states, it should be clear that there is a tendency that a commodity money must be reintroduced. Not every small state, if you have tens of thousands of different states, not every state can have its own paper money, because this would be destructive of the division of labor. It is a purpose of money to facilitate interregional exchange or interpersonal exchange. If every person has its own money, then we are basically back to a system of barter. So if you have very many states, then they must give up national fiat currencies and instead adopt an international commodity money standard that is not controlled by any particular government, but is, so to speak, a spontaneous development brought about by markets. In addition, small countries having to engage in free trade and having to be very liberal internally because they have to avoid the exit risk that people just leaves them. So they have to be attractive places in order to attract productive individuals. Let me end by making the following observation. If you look at countries like, I'll put it this way, many historians have explained, for instance, the success of Europe as an entire region, as compared with other regions of the world, such as China and so forth, by the fact that Europe was not centralized. That Europe was a highly decentralized system with many, many independent political movements, political units. To illustrate this further, Germany, for instance, still in the 19th century, until 1871, was composed of 39 independent states. In Italy, the situation was pretty much the same until the 1860s of the last century. Those were precisely the periods where Germany became the premier country in terms of scientific achievements, cultural achievements, and so forth. Because all of these small entities wanted to be the best, wanted to have the best theaters, wanted to have the best libraries, wanted to have the best universities. Most of them were, of course, princelings, that is, small kings, so to speak, competing against each other vigorously. And the same also applies to Italy. And after 1871 and after the 1860s in Italy, yes, for a while these achievements produced under different conditions continued to go on. People, after all, had been raised under these conditions. But by and large, a decline set in, a cultural decline in these countries. One of the few people who has recognized this is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the most famous poet and writer in the German language, who lived until the early 19th century. That is at the time when efforts were made to unify Germany, but Germany was not yet unified. By the way, this unification of Germany and the unification of Italy was, of course, not a unification that occurred spontaneously because people love to have this sort of stuff. It was a result of war. That is, some of the leading places in Italy, some of the leading places, Prussia in Germany, saw to it that through actual war and threat of war, these other places were forced to become unified under the leadership of Prussia and under leadership of the what house of Italy? I forgot the name right now. In any case, so it was not the result of people spontaneously wanting to unify. It was the result of deliberate warlike policy to unite them. So what did Goethe say about this situation that existed in Germany and the attempts of trying to make Germany a unified state? He said, I do not fear that Germany will not be united. She is united because the German Thaler and Groschen, that's the money that they use, have the same values throughout the entire empire. So they did have money that was used all over the place, despite the fact that they had, of course, different political entities. And because my suitcase can pass through all 36 states without being opened. Germany is united in the areas of weights and measures, trade and migration, and 100 similar things. One is mistaken, however, if one thinks that Germany's unity should be expressed in the form of one large capital city, and that this great city might benefit the masses in the same way that it might benefit the development of a few outstanding individuals. A thoughtful Frenchman, I believe Dopin, has drawn up a map regarding the state of culture in France. France was, of course, centralized hundreds of years before, and is to this day one of the most centralized European states. So a thoughtful Frenchman has drawn up a map regarding the state of culture in France, indicating the higher or lower level of enlightenment of its various départements by lighter or darker colors. There we find, especially in the southern provinces, far away from the capital, some départements painted entirely in black, indicating a complete cultural darkness. Would this be the case if the beautiful France had 10 centers instead of just one, from which light and life radiated? What makes Germany great is her admirable popular culture, which has penetrated all parts of the empire evenly. And is it not the many different princely residences from hence this culture springs, and which are its bearers and curators? Just assume that for centuries only the two capitals of Vienna and Berlin had existed in Germany, or even only a single one. Then I'm wondering what would have happened to the German culture and the widespread prosperity that goes hand in hand with culture. Germany has 20 universities, again this is in 1820, has 20 universities strewn out across the entire empire, more than 100 public libraries, and a similar number of art collections and natural museums. For every prince wanted to attract such beauty and good. Gymnasia, that's higher schools, gymnasia and technical and industrial schools exist in abundance. Indeed, there is hardly a German village without its own school. How is it in this regard in France? As France, disaster. Furthermore, look at the number of German theaters, which exceed 70. The appreciation of music and song and their performance is nowhere as prevalent as in Germany. Then think about cities such as Dresden, Munich, Stuttgart, Kassel, Braunschweig, Hanover, and similar ones. Think about the energy that these cities represent. Think about the effects that they have on neighboring provinces, and ask yourself if all of this would exist if such cities had not been the residences of princes for a long time. Frankfurt, Bremen, Hamburg, Lübeck are large and brilliant, and their impact on the prosperity of Germany is incalculable. Yet, would they remain what they are if they were to lose their independence and be incorporated as provincial cities into one German great empire? I have reason to doubt this. And I think he is absolutely right. And the later experience has borne out this. There has been, so to speak, a civilizational decline in Germany and in Italy since the unification was reached in these countries. And I think the same, by and large, applies to the United States with the effects that Lincoln brought about in particular, that is destroying, so to speak, the relative independence of the individual states and bringing to the fore the almighty powers of the central state. And the same also applies to countries such as Switzerland, where initially the cantons were the all-powerful regions. And in the meantime, of course, it is increasingly the central state of Switzerland that dictates to the cantons what they should do. So as an intermediate goal towards the ultimate goal, that we might want to achieve, I recommend that one consider the idea of splitting off, of creating a large number of independent entities. That is also difficult to accomplish is apparent. I don't have to emphasize that. Central states might crack down on attempts such as this, and it is advisable that if these movements take place, they should not be movements of trying to do what the South did from the North in the 19th century, but to have many cities at different times try to do the same thing. It is far more difficult to crack down on movements such as this taking place at various different places than trying to break away large parts. It is also less threatening if small places go away. I think if a few experiments such as this would be successful, that might create a wave that would be unstoppable. With this, I thank you very much.